They dragged her out in the rain like she was nothing, a young nurse, blood on her scrubs. Hospital security shoving her toward the ambulance bay while cameras rolled. 3 matte black military SUVs screeched to a halt at the entrance. Every person watching froze. This wasn't a firing. This was something else, something bigger. Then the soldiers stepped out and saluted her immediately, and the entire hospital realized they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Hey, if you want to see what happens when a system tries to silence someone who refuses to break, like and comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. The ER at Riverside General in Seattle never actually slowed down. It just got worse. Wednesday nights were always chaos. The kind of controlled panic where doctors moved like they'd choreographed every step 1,000 times before. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired song. The monitors beeped their endless rhythm. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a young woman in navy scrubs was about to lose everything. Her name was Rebecca Walsh, 29 years old. Blonde hair yanked back so tight it probably hurt, though she'd never mention it. The kind of nurse who moved through the ER like she was walking a tightrope, fast enough to matter, controlled enough not to panic the patients. She'd been awake for 16 hours, maybe 17. The blood on her scrubs came from 3 different patients, and she'd stopped keeping track after the second one. Rebecca had learned long ago that if you counted the hours, you started thinking about leaving. She was in Trauma Bay 3, checking the IV line on a crash victim from a highway pileup, when the doors burst open. Not the automatic ones, the main entrance, the ones that meant someone important was arriving. She didn't look up at first. She'd learned that too. Clear the bay. Now. The voice came from somewhere behind her, sharp, accented with the kind of authority that only came from money and politics mixed together. My son needs immediate attention. Rebecca's hands kept moving. The saline was running clean, the catheter was holding. She had 2 more minutes before she needed to recheck the patient's glucose levels. All bays are occupied, she said quietly, not turning around. There's a wait. Shouldn't be long. The man who stepped into her peripheral vision was probably 6 feet tall, built like someone who'd spent his whole life never waiting for anything. His suit probably cost more than her monthly rent. Behind him came 2 younger men in dark blazers, the kind that screamed security detail to anyone paying attention. This was Congressman Daniel Ashford. Rebecca knew that because half the hospital's administration had his family's picture on their office walls. I'm not waiting, Ashford said. His son, unconscious, pale, breathing shallow, was being lowered onto a portable gurney by his security detail. This is my son. He needs... Your son can wait exactly 3 minutes, Rebecca interrupted, and for the first time she turned to face him directly. She made eye contact. She didn't smile. Because those 2 people in surgery right now are going to die if I don't finish prepping this patient first. So your timeline adjusts. The silence that followed was the kind you actually heard. Ashford's face went through several colors. Red came first, then something darker. Do you understand who I am? His voice had dropped, which somehow made it worse. I will have you... all of you. I understand that you have a son with respiratory distress, Rebecca said, her tone remaining level, professional, utterly unmoved. And I understand that my job is to keep people alive, not to prioritize anyone based on who their father is. So, 3 minutes. You can stand there, or you can stand in the waiting room. Both are fine with me. She turned back to her patient. She didn't see Ashford's face, didn't need to. But she heard him leave, fast, probably heading for administration, which meant her 3 minutes just got a lot shorter. Rebecca had known this moment was coming for years. You didn't refuse politicians' demands in a place like Riverside General without consequences. The hospital's board was practically made of people like Ashford, donors, investors, people who understood the hospital the way a successful business understood its profit margins. Patients with insurance and connections got beds closer to the good surgeons. Patients without either got whatever was left. Rebecca had always hated that. She'd just never been stupid enough to say it out loud. Until tonight. She finished her assessment, vitals stabilizing, consciousness returning, good signs, and stepped back from the bay. Time to find the attending surgeon and update them. Time to move on to the next crisis. Time to pretend that what just happened in the last 2 minutes wasn't going to burn her entire life down. The hallway outside Trauma 3 was already flooding with hospital brass. Rebecca recognized the director of operations, two board members she'd seen in hospital newsletters, and worst of all, her own shift supervisor, Margaret Chen, whose expression had already shifted into something between sympathy and calculation. "Rebecca," Margaret said, stepping closer while the administrators continued their quiet conversation 10 feet away. "What exactly happened in there?" "I prioritized emergency cases over a non-critical admission," Rebecca said, "which is hospital protocol, which I've been trained to do, and which—" "That was the congressman," Margaret interrupted quietly. "That was Daniel Ashford." "I'm aware. He's already on the phone with the board." Rebecca watched the administrators glance in her direction. Their faces had that particular hardness that came right before they were about to destroy someone's career. "He's in the waiting room," Margaret continued, and now her voice had dropped even lower. "He's furious. And Rebecca, I need you to understand something. That's the kind of man who doesn't forget this." Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, not fear exactly, recognition. The moment where everything changes. "Are they going to fire me?" Margaret didn't answer, which was answer enough. The walk to the administrative offices felt longer than it should have. Rebecca's mind kept trying to jump ahead. Unemployment, eviction, the apartment she'd been saving for since her second year of nursing school. She thought about her loans, her car payment, the fact that her mother had been asking when she'd have health insurance again after her last job. She pushed all of it down, one step at a time. The board was waiting in the conference room, 7 people in expensive clothes, their phones already out, probably fielding calls from Ashford's lawyers. The director, a man named Howard Reeves, who'd never once looked her in the eye during a staff meeting, sat at the head of the table. "Rebecca Walsh," he began, which was never a good sign. "You're here regarding an incident with Congressman Ashford." "I'm here because I refuse to deprioritize emergency patients," Rebecca said. She remained standing. She'd learned not to sit in situations like this. It felt too much like accepting their authority. "Which is the protocol I was trained to follow." "The protocol," Reeves repeated slowly, "doesn't apply when it affects the hospital's relationship with major donors." There it was. The actual truth, finally spoken out loud. "So your protocol is to let people die so that rich people feel important," Rebecca said. The silence in the room was immediate and total. One of the board members leaned back in her chair. Another one pulled out his phone. Reeves's jaw tightened. "You're suspended, effective immediately," he said coldly. "Pending a formal investigation into insubordination and disrespect toward hospital administration. Security will escort you from the premises. Your badge access is revoked as of right now. You are not to contact patients, staff, or any other hospital personnel without written permission from this office." Rebecca felt her throat tighten. She made herself breathe through it. "And if the investigation finds me in the right?" Reeves smiled. It wasn't a nice expression. "The investigation will find what we need it to find," he said. "Kutusians." The ER floor was still operating at full chaos when security, 2 guys she'd worked with for 3 years, both looking deeply uncomfortable, walked her toward the ambulance bay. They didn't touch her, but they didn't need to. The message was clear. She was no longer welcome here. The rain had started sometime in the last hour, the kind of Seattle drizzle that seemed less like weather and more like the sky's default setting. Rebecca's car was in the employee lot across the street. She could get there, turn the key, sit in the driver's seat for however long it took to feel anything other than numb. She made it to the entrance doors before the monitors started screaming from upstairs. It was the sound of a code, not a normal one, not the steady escalation of a patient deteriorating. This was the sound of something catastrophic happening all at once, the kind of alarm that meant someone was dying right now, in this moment, in a way that couldn't be stopped. The security guards hesitated. So did Rebecca. Her hands knew what to do even while her brain was still processing the fact that she'd been fired. Muscle memory was a strange thing. 3 years of 16-hour shifts had written emergency responses into her DNA at a level deeper than thought. "I need to check what that is," she said. "You're no longer staff," one of the guards said, but his eyes had shifted upward toward where the alarms were still screaming. "You can't—" Rebecca was already moving. She took the back stairs 2 at a time, following the sound of the code. 2nd floor. Intensive care. And when she burst through the trauma suite doors, the scene in front of her was organized chaos with a hard edge of confusion. Ashford's son, still unconscious, still pale, was seizing. Not normal seizure activity. His body was rigid, convulsing at angles that shouldn't have been possible. His respiratory rate spiking beyond anything the monitors could properly track. A resident was calling out vitals in a voice that wavered between professional and panicked. An attending surgeon was running protocols, but his movements had the frozen quality of someone trying to solve a problem he didn't understand. "What happened?" Rebecca asked. "We don't know," the resident said without looking up. "He came in non-responsive, we ran initial blood work, everything looked like standard overdose, but his toxicology came back with something we can't identify. The seizure started 5 minutes ago, and it's not responding to—" "What did the blood work show?" Rebecca was already reading the monitors, already processing. "Specifically, elevated levels of something in his system," the attending said, frustration creeping into his voice. "But the specifics don't match any recreational drug we can identify. It's not in the standard hospital database. It looks like—" He stopped. Rebecca had gone very still. "Like what?" she pressed. "Like something military," one of the junior residents said quietly. "If the chemical signature is what I think it is—" "That's not possible," the attending said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Rebecca knew what military neurotoxins looked like. She'd spent 4 years learning exactly how to treat exposure to things that weren't supposed to exist in civilian hospitals. She'd trained on compounds that had no names in public medical literature. She'd seen what they did to people, both soldiers and civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This looked exactly like that. "He's going into organ failure," she said, pointing at the latest monitor readout. "His kidneys are shutting down. And if that's what I think it is in his bloodstream, we have maybe 8 minutes before the neurological damage becomes irreversible." "Who are you?" the attending demanded. "Rebecca Walsh. I am a trauma nurse, and I've been trained in chemical exposure protocol." She kept her voice level, clinical. "And I know how to treat this. But you have to move right now." The attending looked at her for approximately 2 seconds. Then he looked at the patient. Then he looked back at her. "I don't know you," he said, "and I'm not about to let a random person off the street—" "Because she's right," another voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. There was a woman standing in the frame, mid-50s maybe, gray hair cut sharp, dressed in full military dress uniform despite the hour. Behind her were 3 people in dark federal windbreakers with badges that said FBI in white letters, and behind them, the kind of presence that made the room instinctively make space. A 4-star general. "Dr. Kovac," the general said to the attending, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone used to being obeyed immediately. "Rebecca Walsh is going to take point on this case. You're going to assist her, and you're going to do this right now, or I'm going to have your medical license suspended before you finish asking questions." The attending's face went white. Rebecca felt something settle in her chest, something that had been loose since Reeves smiled at her in that conference room, something that said, "The game just changed." She moved. The orders came out of her mouth like they'd been waiting years to be spoken, confident, rapid fire, exactly the kind of clinical precision that came from training she'd never mentioned to anyone at Riverside General. "Push atropine 0.3 milligrams, she called out. "Someone get me the military exposure protocol kit from locked storage. B basement, east side. No, I don't care if you've never heard of it. Ask the general." The general nodded once. A junior resident sprinted from the room. "He's going into respiratory depression," Rebecca continued, reading the monitors with the focused intensity of someone who'd done this in far worse conditions than a well-lit hospital suite. "Intubate him. Now." The attending moved. So did everyone else. She worked for 8 minutes straight, 8 minutes of absolute focus, of commands and countermands, of watching a human body reject what was happening inside it and fighting anyway. The medication arrived. The protocol kit was retrieved. And slowly, impossibly, Ashford's son's vital signs began to stabilize. His seizures stopped. His respiratory rate normalized. His organs held on. When it was done, when the kid was finally stable and the machines were humming their normal rhythm instead of the alarm shriek, Rebecca stepped back. Her hands were shaking. She clasped them together and made them stop. The room was completely silent except for the monitors. "What the hell is happening?" the attending asked finally. "You're going to want to sit down for this," the general said quietly. And that's when the FBI agent stepped forward, and Rebecca realized that whatever had just happened in this room, however many minutes of her life she'd just spent saving a congressman's son, it was only the opening act of something much larger, something that was about to blow apart everything she thought she understood about the hospital, the congressman, and the system she'd been trained to serve. The federal agents began moving through the room like people who'd found what they were looking for. Their radios crackled, their expressions hardened, and outside the trauma suite, through the reinforced glass, Rebecca could already see more federal vehicles pulling up to the hospital entrance. This wasn't about an overdose anymore. This was about something that reached much higher. To be continued in Part 2, when the truth about Congressman Ashford's real crimes finally surfaces, and Rebecca discovers that her loyalty to her patients just made her the most dangerous person in this hospital. The federal agents moved through the trauma suite like they'd choreographed every step beforehand. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a badge that read Special Agent Torres, positioned herself directly beside Ashford's son's bed, her radio already crackling with updates Rebecca couldn't quite hear. The other agents were already working their phones, their voices low and urgent, the kind of conversation that happened when people realized the situation had just become exponentially worse than they'd anticipated. Rebecca stood against the far wall, still in her blood-stained scrubs, still holding the chemical exposure protocol kit that shouldn't have existed in a civilian hospital's locked storage. No one was paying attention to her anymore. That was probably intentional. She was background noise now, useful, but irrelevant to whatever was actually happening. The general had disappeared into a corner conference call. The attending surgeon was being briefed by two federal investigators who kept asking him questions he clearly couldn't answer. And Ashford himself, the congressman who'd demanded immediate treatment, who'd tried to throw his weight around like it meant something, was conspicuously absent from the entire floor. That absence meant something. "You need to come with me," a voice said. Rebecca looked up. Special Agent Torres was motioning her toward the hallway. Not a request, not a suggestion. A federal mandate dressed up in polite phrasing. They walked in silence to a break room that smelled like old coffee and desperation. Torres closed the door behind them. "How much do you know about military neurotoxins?" Torres asked without preamble. "Enough to recognize one when I see it," Rebecca said. "Enough to know that something like that shouldn't be in a congressman's son's bloodstream unless someone put it there intentionally." "Correct." Torres pulled out a tablet and brought up a series of classified documents. At least they looked classified, given the red headers and restricted markings. 3 weeks ago, a federal research facility outside of Portland reported a theft. High-level bioweapon derivatives, military-grade neurochemical compounds. The kind of thing that doesn't have civilian applications and definitely doesn't have a street value because there's no street for them. They exist for one purpose: military applications. Rebecca felt her stomach shift. She'd known, theoretically, that compounds like this existed. She'd trained on them in a context so removed from normal life that they'd always seemed more theoretical than real. Textbook scenarios, simulation exercises, the kind of thing you learned about and then never expected to encounter in actual civilian medicine. "Ashford stole it?" Rebecca asked. "Not personally," Torres said. She swiped through several more documents: financial records, communications logs, delivery manifests. But his network did. "We've been tracking the theft for 3 weeks. Congressman Ashford has been under investigation for 18 months for illegal weapons trafficking, corruption, and a series of financial transactions that don't have legitimate explanations. His son's overdose, and I'm using the term loosely here, because this wasn't recreational, appears to be connected to the theft. How does a congressman's son end up with a military neurochemical in his system?" Rebecca asked. "That," Torres said, "is the question that's about to make this situation very complicated." She was interrupted by the general appearing in the doorway. Her name was General Catherine Pierce, according to the nameplate on her uniform, and she moved with the kind of authority that made Rebecca understand why everyone in the trauma suite had immediately obeyed her. "The congressman is in custody," Pierce said. "FBI's bringing him in for questioning within the hour. Torres, I need you downstairs. There's a second situation developing." Torres nodded and left, leaving Rebecca alone with the general. Pierce studied her for a long moment, not the kind of cursory evaluation most people gave. This was assessment, measurement, the kind of look someone gave you when they were deciding whether you mattered. You were trained by the military, Pierce said. It wasn't a question. 4 years with the Army Medical Corps, Rebecca said. Trauma medic attached to combat units overseas, specialized training in chemical exposure, ballistic injuries, emergency medical scenarios in hostile environments. That was before I left the service and became a civilian nurse. And you didn't mention any of that when you took this job. It seemed irrelevant to civilian emergency medicine, Rebecca said. I wanted to move past that part of my life. Pierce made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but something close. You can't move past training that good. It just stays dormant until something activates it. She moved further into the break room and closed the door behind her. Rebecca Walsh, Pierce said, I'm about to tell you something that's going to sound insane, and then I'm going to ask you to help with something that's going to put you in an extremely difficult position. But first, you need to understand the actual scope of what we're dealing with. Rebecca waited. The compound in Ashford's son's system was designed for a specific purpose, Pierce continued. It's a neurochemical that was developed as part of a classified defense program that was supposed to be dormant, archived, off the market. It hasn't been used in active warfare scenarios in 5 years. The only people who should know how to manufacture it are 3 scientists who work for the Department of Defense, and all 3 of them are under continuous surveillance. So someone stole it from a secured facility, Rebecca said. Correct. And someone gave it to Ashford's son. Correct again. Why? Pierce sat down on one of the break room's plastic chairs, and for a moment the weight of command dropped away from her face. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who'd spent a very long time dealing with a situation that kept getting worse instead of better. That, Pierce said, is what we're going to figure out. And you're going to help us. The next 4 hours happened in a blur of activity that Rebecca would later struggle to piece together in coherent order. She was moved to a secure office on the administrative floor, an office that had previously belonged to someone in hospital management, judging by the minimalist furniture and the photos of golf outings on the walls. 2 federal agents set up a makeshift operations center, their laptops and equipment transforming the space into something that looked more like a military command post than hospital administration. They showed her files, transcripts of communications, financial records, a map of transactions that traced back through shell companies and offshore accounts, and eventually led to a series of government contracts that shouldn't have existed. Ashford had been selling access. Not information, exactly. Access. He'd used his position in Congress to help people, wealthy people, dangerous people, people who had resources and no ethical boundaries, gain access to federal programs and classified materials. And the neurochemical theft was just the most recent transaction in a years-long series of escalating crimes. The compounds had been intended for a private buyer, someone with money and motivation, and absolutely no legitimate use for a military-grade bioweapon. The delivery had been scheduled for the next day, but somewhere in the chain something had gone wrong. The product had been tested. On someone. On Ashford's son, who'd probably been offered it as a recreational high, and had no idea what he was actually ingesting. Why are you telling me this? Rebecca asked at one point. She was on her 3rd cup of coffee that tasted like it had been made in 2009 and had been staying warm ever since. Because you're the only person in this hospital who can prove what actually happened, one of the agents, Rodriguez, his name tag read, said. Everyone else was either directly involved or willfully blind to what was going on. But you? You were fired for refusing to prioritize Ashford. You have no connection to the hospital's corruption. You have no reason to lie. And you have medical credentials that give your testimony weight. You want me to testify? Rebecca felt something cold settle in her chest. Against a congressman, in federal court. Eventually, Rodriguez said. But first, we need you to do something else. What they needed her to do was walk back into Riverside General like nothing had happened. Margaret Chen found her in the hallway outside the administrative office at 4 a.m. Rebecca had been officially fired. Her badge had been revoked. She had no business being anywhere in this building except maybe security escorting her out. But Margaret's face when she saw her was surprise mixed with something that looked like confusion. Like the entire evening had become so surreal that one more impossible thing didn't even register properly. Rebecca? Margaret said. What are you still doing here? I was asked to stay, Rebecca said. She'd been coached on how to answer this, Vaguely, without details, without raising flags. Some federal complications with the Ashford situation. They wanted to debrief medical personnel. Right. Margaret didn't look convinced, but she was too tired to push it. Everyone on the night shift was operating on fumes at this point. Are you coming back? I don't know, Rebecca said, which was honestly the truest answer she could give. What the federal agents actually wanted was for her to go about her normal routine as much as possible. They wanted her visible in the hospital. They wanted the administration to see her, want to get rid of her, try to pressure her into silence. Everything the hospital did, every threat they made, every attempt to discredit her, it all became evidence. It all went into a growing file that would eventually be handed to prosecutors. Rebecca was bait, expensive bait, the kind that required federal protection and coordination, but bait nonetheless. She spent the next 2 days moving through the hospital like a ghost. The administration had clearly received instructions not to officially fire her yet. The federal presence made them cautious, made them understand that someone was watching every decision they made. But they also couldn't pretend she still worked there. She wasn't scheduled. She wasn't given badge access. She was suspended in a liminal space where she was technically still employed, but completely cut off from actually doing anything. Other staff members avoided her. They'd seen what happened. They understood the math. Getting too close to Rebecca Walsh was a liability. On the morning of the third day, Congressman Ashford was released from federal custody. The news hit the hospital like a seismic event. He'd been detained for questioning, but the federal agents hadn't had enough to charge him yet. The compounds were still being traced through the supply chain. His communications were being analyzed. His associates were being interviewed. But for the moment, he was free. And he was furious. Rebecca watched him arrive at the hospital from a distance. Not physically there, but monitoring the situation through updates that came to her via text from Torres. He stormed through the administrative offices demanding to know why his son's medical records were being reviewed by federal investigators. He threatened lawsuits. He demanded that everyone involved in the investigation be fired. He made it very clear that he understood exactly which people at Riverside General had been cooperating with the feds. Howard Reeves, the hospital director, suddenly became very interested in officially terminating Rebecca's employment. She was called to a formal hearing, legal representatives present, documentation prepared, all the procedural safeguards in place that made it look legitimate. The charges were insubordination, disrespect toward hospital administration, and violation of patient confidentiality protocols, a charge that was completely fabricated, but the legal paperwork was thorough. Rebecca sat in the conference room across from the board, with a federal attorney present to observe, and watched them execute the termination. Reeves read from a prepared statement. The board voted unanimously. She was officially, permanently, irreversibly fired from Riverside General Medical Center. "You've destroyed your career in this field," Reeves said, and he actually smiled when he said it. "I'd advise you to consider a different profession, Ms. Walsh." Rebecca signed the termination papers without argument. She watched Reeves and the board exchange looks that said they'd just successfully protected themselves. They'd removed the liability. They'd removed the threat. Congressman Ashford would be satisfied. She was escorted from the building by the same security guards who'd walked her out 3 days earlier. But between the moment she walked out the hospital doors and the moment she reached her car in the employee lot, her phone buzzed. A text from Torres. "Don't go home. We have a location." Rebecca turned around and walked toward the federal vehicles that had been parked across the street the entire time. No one was paying attention to a fired nurse walking back into the hospital. No one was watching the side entrance where Agent Rodriguez was waiting with a tablet that showed her the reason they'd suddenly escalated everything. The compound manufacturing facility had been found. Not the one that had been stolen from. A different one. An illegal operation built inside a commercial warehouse in South Seattle, equipped with the equipment and expertise necessary to manufacture restricted neurochemicals. Federal agents had discovered it through financial tracking, money that connected directly back to Congressman Ashford's accounts. And the facility had been actively producing compounds, large quantities, enough for multiple deliveries to multiple buyers. "We found records," Rodriguez said, walking with her toward a waiting SUV. Communications between Ashford and several international contacts, people who wanted access to these compounds, people who had resources to pay for them. We're talking about criminal organizations, rogue state actors, People who were planning to use these weapons. What happens now? Rebecca asked. Rebecca, now we move, Torres said from the driver's seat as Rebecca climbed into the vehicle. We've been waiting for probable cause to execute a full federal raid, and thanks to what we found at the manufacturing facility, we have it. Ashford's going to be arrested within the hour. The hospital administration is about to discover that their director just became a person of interest in a federal corruption investigation. The SUV pulled away from the hospital, heading toward the federal building downtown. Rebecca watched Riverside General disappear in the side mirror, the building where she'd spent 3 years, where she'd learned that the system wasn't designed to protect people. It was designed to protect power. And she'd just set it on fire. There's something else, Torres said, keeping her eyes on the road. Something we found in the manufacturing facility that changes everything. Rebecca felt something shift in her chest. In every narrative, there was always another layer, always something deeper. What? She asked. Torres exchanged a look with Rodriguez. The facility wasn't just producing compounds for external sale, Torres said slowly. We found medical records, human trials, subjects who were being exposed to variations of the neurochemical in controlled environments, people who were being used as test subjects without their knowledge or consent. Rodriguez pulled up a file on his tablet and showed it to Rebecca. Names, faces, people, and the hospital logo, Riverside General Medical Center, stamped on every single document. The hospital wasn't just helping Ashford sell weapons, Rodriguez said. The hospital administration was directly involved in conducting the trials. Dr. Reeves, your former director, signed off on the medical protocols. Rebecca felt the world tilt. How many people? She asked. 17 confirmed, Torres said. All of them were admitted through the ER. All of them were claimed to be overdose or trauma cases. All of them were actually being given controlled doses of the neurochemical compound and monitored in secure rooms. When the trials were complete, they were either released or... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. There's more, Torres continued. Ashford's son wasn't the victim here. He was part of it. He was one of the test subjects, and the dose he received wasn't accidental. It was intentional. He was being used to test the compound's effects on someone within the congressman's own family, someone he would want to protect, someone he would move heaven and earth to save. Rebecca understood then. You used me, she said quietly. You knew what was happening. You let it happen. You let me save him so that Ashford would come to the hospital, so that the hospital would move quickly enough that federal agents could find evidence. We saved him, Rodriguez corrected. But yes, we used the situation because people were dying in those rooms, Rebecca. 17 people who had been systematically poisoned and monitored and documented like they were research subjects instead of human beings. And the only way to stop it was to create a situation where Ashford felt desperate enough to move openly. You risked his death, Rebecca said. You risked that kid dying so you could gather evidence. Yes, Torres said, and I would do it again, because the alternative was 17 more deaths while we waited for a warrant we might never have gotten. The hospital had legal protection. The administration had political cover. Without a crisis, without something that forced the system to move faster than it normally would, those people would have kept dying, and Ashford would have kept selling weapons to people who want to use them. Rebecca sat in silence as the federal building came into view. Your medical knowledge, Torres said, saved that kid's life. And in doing that, you saved the lives of everyone else in that facility, because you refused to compromise, because you refused to let power dictate medical ethics. That matters. It doesn't feel like it matters, Rebecca said. It will, Torres replied. But even as she said it, somewhere across the city in a federal detention facility, agents were serving arrest warrants on Congressman Daniel Ashford. And in the administrative offices of Riverside General Medical Center, officers were beginning to question Dr. Howard Reeves about the medical records that had just been discovered. And in 17 different rooms scattered across Seattle, federal agents were beginning to document the systematic human experimentation that had been occurring under the hospital's roof. The system was starting to crack. But Rebecca understood something that Torres didn't, something that would only become clear in the hours and days that followed. This wasn't over. This was just the moment where everything she'd done, everything she'd sacrificed, was about to become public. This was the moment before the world knew her name. This was the moment before she would have to stand in front of cameras and media and attorneys and answer for every decision she'd made. This was the moment before the real fight began. Because Ashford had lawyers, expensive lawyers, the kind that specialized in making federal cases disappear into endless procedural arguments and appeals and legal technicalities. And the hospital had insurance. Insurance had legal teams had connections, and connections, in a city where power and money and politics all flowed in the same river, could move mountains if given enough time and resources. The evidence was solid. The case was strong. The federal agents had done their work well. But Rebecca understood something fundamental about systems that protect themselves. They don't collapse easily. They bend. They adapt. They find new ways to defend the people at the top while sacrificing the people below. And the only person who could stop that, the only person with medical credentials and first-hand knowledge and the absolute refusal to compromise, was a 29-year-old woman who'd just become unemployed and was about to become very, very famous. The SUV pulled into the federal building's secure garage, and as the doors opened to let Rebecca step out into the next phase of her life, she caught her reflection in the glass. She barely recognized the person looking back. The next 72 hours would reshape everything. The investigation would explode across every news network in the country. The hospital's secrets would begin to crack open. And Rebecca Walsh would discover that being right about something and surviving the consequences of being right were two entirely different things. The federal building's interrogation rooms were designed to be deliberately uncomfortable. Concrete walls painted institutional gray. A metal table bolted to the floor. A single window with one-way glass that let the observers watch, while the observed person felt completely alone. Rebecca sat across from a prosecutor named James Dalton, early 60s, the kind of man who'd spent 3 decades watching criminals try to outmaneuver the law, which had given him a particular kind of weariness that couldn't be faked. "Walk me through what you saw," Dalton said, his voice steady, his hands folded on the table in front of him. No recorder, no documentation yet. This was just the initial debrief, the moment where they confirmed Rebecca's story aligned with what the federal agents already knew. "I saw a patient in critical condition," Rebecca said. Her voice sounded strange in the small room. "I recognized the symptom profile of exposure to a restricted compound. I provided medical intervention. The patient stabilized." "And you didn't question why a congressman's son would have military-grade neurotoxins in his bloodstream?" "I questioned it," Rebecca said. "I just knew the answer wasn't my concern at that moment. The medical crisis was my concern." Dalton made a note. He made a lot of notes. Every few minutes, he'd write something down without explaining what, without indicating what specific detail had triggered the notation. It was a psychological tactic. Keep the witness wondering. Keep them slightly off balance. Make them want to fill the silence with more information than they'd intended to provide. Rebecca had been trained to recognize these tactics. She didn't fall for them. "What we have," Dalton said after nearly an hour of questions, "is a strong federal case against Congressman Ashford for weapons trafficking, corruption, and conspiracy. What we're missing is the connection to Riverside General. We know the hospital was involved. We know Dr. Reeves approved experimental protocols. We know patients were being used as test subjects, but we need testimony that puts the hospital's action in sequence with Ashford's criminal activity." "I can testify to what I observed," Rebecca said. "I know you can. But I need you to understand something." Dalton leaned back in his chair. Ashford has already retained what amounts to a small army of criminal defense attorneys. The hospital has insurance and legal teams. They're going to fight this viciously. They're going to claim that medical personnel were following standard protocols. They're going to say that Ashford wasn't directly involved in hospital operations. They're going to argue procedural violations in the federal investigation, and they're going to try very hard to discredit you. "How?" Rebecca asked. "By suggesting you have a vendetta. By highlighting that you were fired immediately before this investigation became public. By arguing that you're seeking revenge for your employment termination. They'll have expert witnesses testify that your medical decisions were questionable. They'll find any possible angle that makes you look like you have motivation to lie." Dalton pulled out a tablet and showed her a digital file. It was already happening. Within hours of Ashford's arrest becoming public, media outlets had picked up the story. but not the story Torres and the federal agents wanted told. Instead, the narrative was, fired nurse accuses congressman and hospital of crimes, federal investigation launched, credibility questioned. There was video footage of her being escorted out by security. There were statements from hospital officials claiming she'd been terminated for legitimate performance issues. There was a legal analysis by some talking head suggesting that her testimony would likely be challenged based on potential bias. The system had activated its defense mechanisms with remarkable speed. We'll protect you, Dalton said. Federal marshal protection if necessary, but you need to understand what you're signing up for. Testifying in a federal case isn't like TV. It's slow. It's grueling. They will attack your credibility for hours. They will try to make you angry, make you seem unreliable, make you look like someone with an axe to grind. I didn't have a vendetta when I refused to prioritize Ashford's son, Rebecca said. I had medical ethics. I won't suddenly develop a vendetta now. Dalton studied her for a moment, then he nodded. Good, he said, because we're going to need that clarity. The trial isn't going to happen for at least 6 months, probably longer. And in the meantime, things are going to get messy. Messy didn't adequately describe what happened next. Within 48 hours, Ashford's legal team had filed a motion to suppress the evidence found at the manufacturing facility, claiming the federal raid lacked proper probable cause. Within 72 hours, the hospital's insurance company had launched a public relations campaign emphasizing Riverside General's commitment to patient safety and suggesting that any experimental protocols had been approved by proper medical oversight boards. And by day 5, Rebecca couldn't get groceries without someone recognizing her. It started small. A cashier at the supermarket doing a double take. Someone on the street muttering her name as she walked past. But by the end of the first week, reporters had set up a semi-permanent camp outside the federal building. Her apartment address had been leaked to media outlets. She'd received her first death threat by email, 3 lines of text that said she was a traitor to American heroes and she should prepare for consequences. Torres arranged for a marshal to be stationed outside her apartment. Not a visible presence, but someone watching the building, monitoring foot traffic, ready to respond if the threats escalated from digital to physical. Rebecca stopped leaving her apartment. She had her groceries delivered. She took her depositions via secure video conference instead of in person, and she watched the case develop from her living room via news outlets and federal updates and encrypted communications from Dalton's team. The narrative was fragmenting. On one side, federal prosecutors were releasing carefully edited information that presented Ashford as a criminal mastermind who'd weaponized the hospital for his illegal activities. On the other side, Ashford's legal team was painting him as a victim of federal overreach, suggesting that rogue hospital administrators had acted without his knowledge or consent, and that his son's overdose was a tragedy that had nothing to do with his political career. The public was split. Online, people were arguing about whether Ashford was a villain or a scapegoat. News channels were bringing on legal analysts who disagreed about whether the federal evidence was compelling or circumstantial. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Rebecca's role kept shifting. The media had decided she was either a hero or a vengeful ex-employee, and they couldn't seem to decide which one they wanted to be true. On the 14th day of her sequestration, Torres came to her apartment with an update. The federal investigation into Riverside General had expanded. FBI agents had been combing through years of hospital records. They'd found evidence that the experimental protocols had been ongoing for longer than initially thought. They'd discovered additional test subjects, not just the 17 they'd initially found, but potentially dozens more, scattered across different admission records, documented under different diagnoses. How many? Rebecca asked. We're still counting, Torres said. She looked exhausted. Federal prosecutors always looked exhausted during major cases, like they were fighting against an enemy that didn't need sleep. But we're talking about a systematic operation that had been running for at least 3 years. The hospital was literally using patients as research subjects without informed consent. What happens to those patients? Rebecca asked. That's complicated, Torres said, and she was quiet for a moment. Some of them recovered. Some of them don't remember what happened. Some of them are still dealing with neurological side effects from the compound exposure. And some of them, we found death certificates. Patients who died at Riverside General under conditions that were marked as natural causes. We're now going back through those cases trying to determine if the deaths were actually related to the experimental protocols. Rebecca felt something cold and heavy settle in her chest. She'd understood, theoretically, that this was a significant criminal operation. But understanding it theoretically and understanding that people had died, people who'd come to the hospital seeking treatment and instead had been poisoned as test subjects, were fundamentally different things. The hospital's legal team is already preparing their defense, Torres continued. They're claiming that the experimental protocols were approved by the hospital's ethics board, that informed consent was obtained, and that the deaths were unrelated to the compound exposure. They're also beginning to assert that certain hospital staff members were acting independently without approval from senior administration. They're trying to create a firewall between Reeves and the rest of the hospital. Is it working? Rebecca asked. Not yet, Torres said, but they're good at this. They have money and experience and access to legal resources most people can't even comprehend. They're going to keep fighting until they find an angle that sticks. She pulled out a tablet and showed Rebecca something that made her stomach drop. It was a memo. Internal hospital communication between Dr. Reeves and another administrator named Dr. Patricia Voss, who served on the hospital's ethics board. The memo discussed the experimental protocols, outlined the medical justification, and, most damaging, included a note from Voss saying that the protocols had been approved with standard regulatory language included. But there was something else in the memo, a note from Reeves that said, "Make sure the patient consent forms are documented properly. If anyone asks about the compound exposure later, we need to be able to show that informed consent was obtained." The language was coded, but the implication was clear. Reeves had been aware that what was happening might eventually require legal defense. He'd been conscious of the need to create documentation that could protect the hospital if the protocols were ever questioned. "This is the smoking gun," Torres said. "This is what proves intent." Reeves didn't just approve an experiment. He approved an experiment while explicitly planning how to defend it if challenged. "So you have him," Rebecca said. "We have documents," Torres corrected. "What we still need is testimony that establishes the timeline, that shows when the protocols started, who approved them, how they connected to Ashford's criminal activity, and how they connected to Ashford's criminal activity. We need someone who can explain the medical and administrative context in a way that makes it clear this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate." Torres looked directly at Rebecca. "That someone is you," she said. "You're going to be the federal prosecution's primary witness. You're going to stand in front of a jury and explain why a nurse with your training recognized immediately that something was wrong. You're going to explain what you saw, what you did, what you understand about military neurotoxins, and why their presence in a civilian hospital is an immediate red flag." "When?" Rebecca asked. "The trial is set for 4 months from now," Torres said. "Federal court, United States versus Daniel Ashford and Riverside General Medical Center. The prosecution will go first, and we need you to be our anchor testimony. The moment that makes the jury understand that this wasn't complicated or ambiguous. It was wrong." 4 months of waiting was 4 months of the case developing in the media, in legal filings, in the public consciousness. And during those 4 months, the narrative kept shifting. Ashford's legal team filed 17 different motions challenging the evidence. The hospital's legal team filed 19, each one arguing a different procedural violation or constitutional principle. Meanwhile, federal prosecutors kept releasing new information to the media, details about the experimental protocols, statements from other hospital employees who'd grown uncomfortable with what was happening, testimony from patients who remembered fragments of what had been done to them. The case became a referendum on the entire system. People started arguing about hospital oversight. They started questioning who regulated experimental protocols. They started wondering how many other hospitals might be doing similar things. Rebecca became a public figure, whether she wanted to be one or not. She gave a deposition that was leaked to media outlets, which meant every legal team involved suddenly had access to her exact testimony. She'd been careful with her words, but careful didn't matter when everything was ammunition. Ashford's attorneys highlighted moments where she hesitated, where she admitted uncertainty, where she qualified her statements with phrases like "I believe" or "it appeared." Suddenly, those qualifications became evidence of her unreliability. News outlets began running stories about whether Rebecca Walsh had a political motivation. Some questioned whether the federal government was using her as a pawn. Others suggested she was seeking revenge against the hospital. Still others argued that she was being used as a political tool in a larger campaign against Ashford. The death threats escalated. The first one had been vague. The subsequent ones became increasingly specific. Someone posted her address online. Someone else created a document claiming she was a federal informant who turned against her colleagues for money. Someone else started a social media campaign suggesting she was a liar and a traitor. The marshals stationed outside her apartment became 2 marshals. They installed security upgrades to her door. They established protocols for her to move through the building without being exposed to foot traffic. She was sequestered in her own home under federal protection, waiting for the trial that would either validate everything she'd done or destroy her in front of the entire country. 3 weeks before the trial was set to begin, Torres came to her apartment with news that changed everything. "Dr. Reeves is going to plead guilty," Torres said without preamble. "We negotiated a deal. He'll accept responsibility for the experimental protocols in exchange for a reduced sentence and immunity from the conspiracy charges." "What does that mean?" Rebecca asked. "It means he's going to testify for the prosecution," Torres said. "It means he's going to establish that the hospital was aware of what was happening, that the protocols were approved by administration, that the connection to Ashford was deliberate and financial. It means he's going to confirm everything you're going to say, but from the perspective of someone inside the hospital." Rebecca understood what this meant. Reeves' testimony would corroborate hers, but it also meant that Ashford's legal team would pivot their entire strategy. If they couldn't attack the medical evidence, they'd attack the credibility of the people providing it. They'd suggest that Reeves was cooperating to save himself. They'd suggest that Rebecca was motivated by revenge. They'd create doubt through narrative rather than fact. "There's something else," Torres said. She pulled up a news article on her tablet. "The hospital is filing for bankruptcy protection. They're claiming that the legal liability from the experimental protocols has made them insolvent. They're trying to reorganize their debt in a way that limits their liability to victims." It was brilliant, in a vicious way. The hospital couldn't be held fully liable if they didn't have assets to pay. Any judgment against them would be a fraction of what it should have been. Any compensation to victims would be distributed across a years-long bankruptcy process that would drain resources and patience. The system was adapting. The system was protecting itself. "What does this do to the case?" Rebecca asked. "It doesn't actually affect the criminal case," Torres said. "Ashford and Reeves will still be prosecuted. The hospital will still face criminal charges as an institution, but it does mean that the victims of the experimental protocols are going to be fighting through bankruptcy courts for compensation instead of being awarded damages in civil court. The hospital's strategy is to disperse liability, to make accountability so complicated and fragmented that no single judgment can fully punish what happened." Rebecca felt something shift inside her. Anger, maybe, or clarity. The understanding that even if she testified perfectly, even if the prosecution won, the system had mechanisms to protect itself that went far deeper than individual criminal cases. "The trial starts Monday," Torres continued. "Jury selection happens this week. You'll be called to testify on day 3 or 4, depending on how quickly we get through the prosecution's preliminary witnesses. Are you ready?" Rebecca wasn't ready. She'd never be ready. But she nodded anyway. Shit. The federal courthouse was surrounded by media when Rebecca arrived Monday morning. Cameras, reporters, people holding signs that ranged from "Justice for Victims" to "Stop the Federal Witch Hunt." The marshal escorted her through the chaos toward a side entrance that the prosecution had arranged to keep her away from the cameras. The courtroom itself was smaller than she'd expected. Not intimate exactly, but constrained. The judge sat elevated above the main floor. Ashford was at a table with his legal team, 5 attorneys in expensive suits, all of them looking like they'd never been questioned in their lives. Reeves was in a separate section, conspicuously distant from the defendant, making the split explicit. The jury had already been selected. 12 people and 4 alternates, all of them sworn to evaluate the evidence and render a verdict based on the facts presented. Rebecca studied their faces and tried to understand what they were thinking, what they would decide, whether any of them had already made up their minds before the trial even started. The prosecution went first. The opening statement was methodical, clinical, presenting the evidence in sequence. The financial records, the stolen compounds, the experimental protocols, the death threats that had been issued to keep people quiet. The narrative was designed to build, piece by piece, toward an inescapable conclusion. Congressman Daniel Ashford had deliberately engaged in weapons trafficking, had used his political position to facilitate the sale of restricted military compounds, and had utilized a hospital as part of the criminal conspiracy. Ashford's legal team then presented their opening statement, which was a masterpiece of misdirection. They didn't argue that the crimes hadn't happened. Instead, they argued that Ashford's personal involvement was minimal. They suggested that rogue hospital administrators had acted independently. They claimed that Ashford's financial records, while suspicious, could be explained through normal political activity. They presented him as a victim of federal overreach, caught in a web of criminal activity that had occurred without his knowledge or consent. The first witnesses were federal agents who'd conducted the investigation. They testified about the manufacturing facility, the stolen compounds, the financial transactions that connected Ashford to the criminal enterprise. It was dry, methodical, designed to establish the basic facts without interpretation. Ashford's attorneys cross-examined each witness with the kind of aggressive persistence that was designed to plant seeds of doubt. They questioned methodologies. They highlighted gaps in the evidence. They suggested that the federal investigation had been predetermined to target Ashford regardless of what the actual facts showed. By the end of day 2, Rebecca could see the jury's attention beginning to fragment. The legal arguments were abstract. The evidence was technical. The case was starting to feel complicated instead of clear. On day 3, Rebecca was called to testify. She was sworn in. She sat in the witness box. And as she turned to face the prosecutor, she understood that every moment from this point forward would be scrutinized, analyzed, and used to either prove the case or destroy it. The prosecution walked her through her background first: military service, medical training, specialized knowledge of chemical compounds. They established her credibility before asking her to describe what she'd seen. When she explained her recognition of the neurochemical in Ashford's son's bloodstream, she wasn't speaking in medical jargon. She was explaining, clearly and directly, why someone with her training would immediately understand that something was catastrophically wrong. The jury leaned forward. They were listening now. But when Ashford's lead attorney, a woman named Margaret Chen, sharp-eyed and ruthless, stood up for cross-examination, the entire tone shifted. "Ms. Walsh, you were fired from Riverside General the night before you provided medical treatment to Congressman Ashford's son, correct?" "I was terminated, yes," Rebecca said carefully, "after I refused to deprioritize emergency patients to make room for his son. And that termination was devastating to your career, was it not?" "It was significant," Rebecca said, "but I stand by the decision I made." "Prior to your termination, you had no idea that Congressman Ashford had any connection to military compounds, correct?" "Correct." "So when you treated his son, you were treating him as a medical patient, not as a way to gather evidence against his father?" "I was treating a patient in critical condition," Rebecca said. "My personal feelings about his father were irrelevant." Margaret Chen smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the expression of someone who'd just scored a point and wanted to make sure everyone knew it. "Tell me, Ms. Walsh, in all your years of medical training, how much instruction did you receive in federal criminal investigation?" "None," Rebecca said. "I'm a nurse, not a federal agent. Yet you seem to understand quite a lot about restricted military compounds, classified defense programs, and federal weapons trafficking, don't you?" "I understand enough to recognize when I'm encountering something outside normal civilian medical parameters," Rebecca said. "That's what my training was designed to teach me." "Your training? The training you received while working for the Department of Defense?" "Yes." "Tell the jury, Ms. Walsh, when you left the military, did you leave on good terms?" Rebecca felt the question land. It was designed to suggest that she had a vendetta against the military, against authority, against the government itself. It was designed to make her look unstable. "I left because I wanted to work in civilian medicine," Rebecca said. She kept her voice level. "I had a good record of service. I received an honorable discharge. And yet you clearly held significant resentments about your time serving." "I didn't," Rebecca said. "I had resentments about specific decisions made by specific people, but I valued the training I received." The cross-examination continued for hours. Margaret Chen attacked from every possible angle. She suggested Rebecca had misidentified the chemical compound. She questioned her medical judgment. She implied that Rebecca had been coached by federal agents to provide testimony that fit a predetermined narrative. She painted a picture of a vindictive, unstable, potentially dishonest nurse who'd been fired and was now seeking revenge through the federal court system. When Rebecca was finally allowed to leave the witness stand, she felt hollowed out. She'd answered every question truthfully. She'd maintained her composure. She'd presented her testimony clearly and professionally. And she still wasn't certain it had mattered. Margaret Chen had successfully created doubt, and in criminal cases, doubt was often enough. Reeves testified the next day, and his testimony was more devastating than Rebecca's had been. As the actual hospital administrator who'd approved the protocols, his words carried an institutional weight that hers couldn't match. He detailed the decision-making process. He explained the financial arrangements. He described how the hospital had systematically documented the experimental protocols in ways designed to appear legitimate while actually serving as evidence of intentional deception. But even his testimony was undercut by the reality that he'd negotiated a plea deal. Ashford's attorneys suggested that he was lying to reduce his sentence. They questioned his credibility by highlighting the fact that he'd negotiated immunity in exchange for testimony. They painted him as a self-serving administrator willing to destroy his former employer to save himself. A week into the trial, Ashford's legal team played what they'd clearly been planning as their counterattack all along. They called witnesses who testified that Ashford had been unaware of the hospital's experimental protocols. They called political colleagues who suggested that Ashford's financial records reflected normal campaign activities. They called expert witnesses who testified that the chemical compound could have been obtained through multiple channels, not necessarily through criminal trafficking. And they called a federal agent to the stand, not one of Torres's investigators, but someone from a different department, who suggested that the federal investigation might have been compromised by political motivation. The testimony was vague enough to be legally acceptable, but specific enough to plant serious questions about whether the entire federal case was actually a political persecution rather than legitimate criminal prosecution. The jury was clearly struggling. Rebecca could see it in their faces. Some of them were leaning toward conviction. Others seemed uncertain. A few appeared to be leaning toward acquittal. On the 15th day of the trial, during a recess, Torres pulled Rebecca aside in a secure hallway. "We're losing," Torres said without preamble. "The jury is fragmenting. Chen has created enough doubt that even if some jurors believe Ashford is guilty, there might not be enough consensus for conviction. We're looking at a hung jury, which means a mistrial, which means we get to start over and potentially lose even more momentum." "What can we do?" Rebecca asked. "Rebecca, there's something else," Torres said. She pulled up a video on her phone. It showed surveillance footage from inside the manufacturing facility. It showed people in hazmat suits moving containers of chemical compounds. But more importantly, at one point in the footage, someone removed their protective gear, and when they did, their face was clearly visible. It was Congressman Daniel Ashford. "Where did this come from?" Rebecca asked. "The manufacturing facility security system," Torres said. "We found it during the raid, but his legal team has been arguing that it's inadmissible because of how the evidence was obtained. The judge has been considering their motion to suppress it for the entire trial. But the judge is about to rule, and if he allows it into evidence, it's over," Rebecca finished. Torres nodded. "It's over. But the judge has to make the ruling, and judges don't always rule the way prosecutors hope they will." The courtroom reconvened. The judge, a man named Warren Michaels, who'd been careful to remain impartial throughout the entire proceeding, called for arguments on Ashford's motion to suppress the surveillance footage. Margaret Chen argued that the evidence had been obtained in violation of constitutional protections. She suggested that the federal raid on the manufacturing facility had lacked proper warrant authorization. She claimed that the surveillance system hadn't been properly documented as evidence. The prosecution countered that the raid had been conducted with full federal authority, that all proper procedures had been followed, and that the evidence was directly relevant to establishing Ashford's personal involvement in the criminal enterprise. Judge Michaels listened to both sides. He asked questions. He reviewed the documentation. And then, after what felt like an impossibly long silence, he made his ruling. "The motion to suppress is denied," he said. "The evidence will be admissible." The courtroom erupted into motion. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse. Media outlets began running the breaking news. And in the secure federal building where Rebecca was being held, Torres permitted herself something that might have been a smile. "They're going to show the footage to the jury tomorrow," Torres said. "And after they see Ashford removing his protective gear inside a facility manufacturing restricted military compounds, there's going to be very little doubt about his personal involvement." But even as she said it, Rebecca realized something that Torres, career federal prosecutor, someone who dealt in facts and evidence and legal procedure, might not have fully grasped. Ashford's legal team would use that footage too. They would argue that it was a setup. They would suggest that Ashford had been visiting the facility for innocent reasons. They would create narratives around it that might not be true, but would plant seeds of reasonable doubt. And in a criminal case, reasonable doubt was all that was needed for acquittal. Rebecca thought about the patients who died in Riverside General's experimental protocols. She thought about the 17 people who'd been poisoned as test subjects. She thought about the system that had protected that experimentation for years until someone had finally forced it into the light. And she understood something that was going to become painfully clear in the hours that followed. Justice and guilt weren't the same thing. Evidence and conviction weren't the same thing. And a system designed to protect itself could absorb almost any amount of pressure without actually changing. The footage was shown to the jury the next morning. Ashford's face was unmistakable in the video. He was removing protective gear inside a manufacturing facility producing restricted military compounds. The evidence was visually undeniable. Ashford's legal team had one final piece of their strategy prepared, and they deployed it immediately. They filed an emergency motion requesting a mistrial based on what they claimed was prosecutorial misconduct in how the surveillance footage had been obtained and presented. The motion was frivolous, designed purely to disrupt the trial's momentum and give them time to coordinate their strategy. Judge Michaels denied it almost immediately. And as the jury filed back into the courtroom to receive final instructions before deliberation, Rebecca understood that what happened next would determine not just Ashford's fate, but what kind of message would be sent to every other person who thought they could use power and money to protect themselves from accountability. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Then they came back with their verdict. The jury foreman stood. The paper in his hand didn't shake, but his voice carried the weight of 16 days of testimony, hours of deliberation, and a decision that would reshape how the public understood institutional corruption. "On the charge of weapons trafficking," he read, "we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled, a collective release of tension that had been building since the trial began. Rebecca felt something loosen in her chest, not relief exactly, something more complicated, the understanding that guilt and justice weren't the same thing, but at least one had been established. "On the charge of conspiracy to distribute restricted materials," the foreman continued, "we find the defendant guilty." Ashford's face went blank, not shocked, not angry, just empty, like someone had suddenly unplugged whatever mechanism had been keeping him animated throughout the trial. His attorneys were already moving, shuffling papers, preparing motions, doing what expensive legal teams did when they lost battles but refused to concede wars. The foreman read through 7 more charges, guilty on all counts. Judge Michaels accepted the verdict without ceremony. He scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. He dismissed the jury with instructions not to speak to media. And as the courtroom began to empty, federal marshals moved to take Ashford into custody pending sentencing. That's when the facade finally cracked. "This is political persecution," Ashford said, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "You're destroying me because I refuse to cooperate with federal overreach. This entire trial was—" "Mr. Ashford," Judge Michaels interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even convicted criminals stop talking. "You will have an opportunity to speak at sentencing. Until then, you are remanded to federal custody." The marshals escorted him out through a side door. Media cameras outside caught the moment. A congressman in handcuffs being loaded into a federal vehicle, his expensive suit somehow looking cheaper under the harsh afternoon light. Rebecca watched from a secure hallway as the convoy departed. Torres stood beside her, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "We won," Torres said. "Part of it," Rebecca replied. Because Ashford was just one piece. The hospital was still operating. The bankruptcy protection was still in place. The victims of the experimental protocols were still fighting through legal proceedings that would take years to resolve. The system had been damaged, but it hadn't collapsed. The media narrative shifted within hours. Where previously the coverage had been divided between congressmen wrongfully accused and criminal conspiracy exposed, now the story consolidated around a single theme: institutional corruption finally held accountable. News outlets ran retrospectives on Ashford's political career, highlighting moments that, in hindsight, suggested a pattern of ethical violations that had simply never been prosecuted. Rebecca became the human face of that accountability. Reporters wanted interviews, networks wanted exclusive stories, publishers wanted book deals. She declined all of it. Torres had advised her to wait until after sentencing, but Rebecca's reasons were more fundamental. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted the system to change. 3 days after the verdict, Torres came to Rebecca's apartment with an update that made the distinction between those two things very clear. Riverside General's bankruptcy proceeding is collapsing, Torres said. She looked tired, which meant something significant had happened. Federal prosecutors didn't get tired from routine developments. The court-appointed trustee found evidence that the hospital had been systematically hiding assets in offshore accounts. The bankruptcy wasn't legitimate. It was another layer of fraud designed to protect the hospital's real money from victim compensation claims. Can they prosecute that? Rebecca asked. They already are, Torres said. Federal prosecutors filed charges this morning against the hospital's board of directors for bankruptcy fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud victims. The judge overseeing the bankruptcy case is furious. He's already indicated he's going to dismiss the bankruptcy protection and allow civil claims to proceed against the hospital's actual assets. Rebecca understood what this meant. The victims, the 17 people who'd been poisoned as test subjects, the families of patients who died under suspicious circumstances, would finally have a path to compensation. Not through a years-long bankruptcy process that would drain their resources, but through direct civil claims against a hospital that had money and could be held accountable. There's something else, Torres continued. She pulled up a news article on her tablet. Dr. Patricia Voss, the ethics board member who approved the experimental protocols, was arrested this morning. Federal agents found evidence that she'd been receiving direct payments from Ashford's network. She wasn't just approving the protocols. She was being paid specifically to provide the medical legitimacy that made the entire operation look legal. The article included a photo of Voss being led from her home in handcuffs. Her expression was the particular kind of shock that came from people who'd never expected consequences for their actions. How many people are they arresting? Rebecca asked. 12 hospital administrators so far, Torres said. The investigation is expanding. Every financial transaction is being audited. Every administrative decision is being reviewed. The hospital thought they could compartmentalize the corruption, keep it contained to specific departments, specific people. But once you start pulling on threads in a system this compromised, the entire thing unravels. Rebecca thought about the nurse who'd fired her, Howard Reeves, whose plea deal had probably saved him from decades in federal prison. The board members who'd voted to terminate her employment without questioning why a congressman was demanding immediate treatment. The security guards who'd escorted her out while cameras rolled. What happens to the hospital? Rebecca asked. That depends, Torres said. If the federal government decides to pursue criminal charges against Riverside General as an institution, not just individuals, the hospital could lose its operating license. It could be forced to shut down entirely. Or it could be restructured under federal oversight, with new administration, new protocols, and monitoring that ensures this never happens again. Which do you think will happen? Torres was quiet for a moment. I think the hospital employs 3,000 people. I think it serves a region of Seattle that doesn't have many other emergency care options. I think shutting it down would hurt the same people who were already hurt by the experimental protocols. So I think federal oversight is more likely. But I also think that decision is going to be political, and politics don't always prioritize what's right over what's convenient. What? Ashford's sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the verdict, which gave his legal team time to file every possible motion for leniency, reduced charges, and reconsideration. They argued that Ashford had been a public servant for 2 decades. They highlighted his charitable work. They brought character witnesses who testified that he'd been a dedicated father and committed community member. They painted a picture of a man who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to have his entire life destroyed. The prosecution countered with victims. They brought in patients who'd been poisoned as test subjects. They brought in family members of people who died under suspicious circumstances at Riverside General. They brought in military personnel who explained exactly what the stolen compounds could do in the wrong hands. And they brought in financial analysts who detailed how much money Ashford had made from his criminal enterprise, transactions totaling millions of dollars, funneled through offshore accounts and shell companies designed to hide his involvement. Rebecca was asked to provide a victim impact statement, not as someone who'd been directly harmed by the experimental protocols, but as someone whose career and life had been systematically dismantled when she'd refused to participate in the system that enabled them. She declined, not because she didn't have things to say, but because she understood something fundamental about public testimony. It became ammunition. Whatever she said would be analyzed, quoted, weaponized by media outlets and legal teams, and people with agendas that had nothing to do with actual justice. She'd already testified once. That had been enough. But on the morning of the sentencing hearing, Torres called her with a request that changed her calculus. "The judge wants to hear from you," Torres said. "Not a formal victim impact statement, just a few words about why you made the decisions you made. He's trying to understand the human context behind the medical and legal arguments." "Why?" Rebecca asked. "Because Ashford's legal team is still arguing that you had a vendetta, that you made decisions based on personal animosity rather than medical ethics, and the judge wants to hear your perspective before he hands down the sentence." Rebecca thought about refusing again, but then she thought about the patients who'd died, the families who'd lost people, the system that had protected itself for years until someone had finally forced it to acknowledge what it had been doing. She agreed to speak. The courtroom was packed for sentencing. Media filled the gallery. Victims and their families occupied the front rows, and Ashford sat at the defense table looking smaller than he had during the trial, like conviction had physically diminished him. Judge Michaels called the hearing to order and asked if anyone wished to speak before sentencing. Rebecca was invited forward. She stood at the podium facing the judge. She didn't look at Ashford. She didn't look at his attorneys. She looked at the judge and spoke in the same level, professional tone she'd used when testifying. "I'm not here to ask for a specific sentence," she said. "That's not my place. I'm here because I was asked to explain why I made the decisions I made the night Congressman Ashford brought his son to Riverside General." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I refused to prioritize his son because doing so would have meant deprioritizing other patients who were already in critical condition. That wasn't a political decision. It wasn't personal animosity. It was medical ethics, the kind I was trained to follow both in the military and in civilian medicine. The kind that says every patient matters equally, regardless of who their family is or how much power they have." The courtroom was completely silent. "When I was fired for that decision," Rebecca continued, "I understood that the hospital was protecting its relationship with powerful people at the expense of actual medical care. And when I later discovered that the hospital had been conducting experimental protocols on patients without informed consent, I understood that the corruption wasn't isolated. It was systemic. It was the way the institution functioned." She looked directly at Judge Michaels. "I don't have a vendetta against Congressman Ashford," she said. "I have a problem with systems that protect power instead of people. And I testified in this trial because someone needed to say, clearly and without equivocation, that what happened at Riverside General was wrong. Not complicated, not ambiguous, wrong." She stepped back from the podium. Ashford's lead attorney immediately stood to object, to argue that Rebecca's statement was prejudicial, that it was designed to influence sentencing rather than provide factual context. Judge Michaels overruled the objection with the look that suggested he'd heard enough from the defense. "Ms. Walsh," the judge said, "thank you for your statement." She returned to her seat in the gallery. Torres gave her a small nod. Then Judge Michaels delivered the sentence. "Mr. Ashford," he began, "you have been convicted of 7 federal crimes that represent a systematic betrayal of public trust. You used your position as a United States congressman to facilitate weapons trafficking. You participated in a criminal conspiracy that resulted in the deaths of American citizens. You enriched yourself through illegal means while claiming to serve the public interest." Ashford's attorneys were preparing their papers, already planning the appeals that would follow. "The prosecution has recommended a sentence of 35 years in federal prison," Judge Michaels continued. "The defense has requested leniency based on your years of public service. I have considered both recommendations, and I have reviewed the evidence presented during trial extensively." He looked directly at Ashford. I sentence you to 42 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 28 years. You will also pay restitution to the victims of your criminal enterprise in an amount to be determined by separate proceedings. You will forfeit all assets obtained through illegal means, and you will be permanently barred from holding any position of public trust. The courtroom reaction was immediate and loud. Ashford's attorneys were shouting objections. Victims in the gallery were crying. Media in the back were already filing their stories. And Ashford himself sat motionless, staring at the judge like he couldn't quite process what had just been said. 42 years. For a man in his early 60s, that was effectively a life sentence. Judge Michaels gavelled the room back to order. This court is adjourned. Federal marshals moved to take Ashford into custody. As they led him from the courtroom, he looked toward Rebecca, not with anger, but with something closer to confusion, like he genuinely couldn't understand how he'd ended up here, how the system he'd manipulated for years had finally turned against him. Rebecca held his gaze until he was gone. Bolshik. The news coverage that followed was relentless. Every network ran the story. Every outlet analyzed the sentence. Legal experts debated whether 42 years was appropriate or excessive. Political commentators argued about what the verdict meant for congressional oversight and institutional accountability. But while the public conversation focused on Ashford, the more significant developments were happening at Riverside General. The hospital's board of directors had been replaced by a federal oversight committee. The new administration immediately suspended all experimental protocols pending comprehensive review. They opened the hospital's financial records for public audit. They established a victims' compensation fund using the assets that had been hidden in offshore accounts. And they began the process of rebuilding institutional trust that had been systematically destroyed over years of corruption. Dr. Patricia Voss pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She received 12 years in federal prison. 6 other hospital administrators accepted plea deals that ranged from probation to 8 years in prison, depending on their level of involvement. Howard Reeves, whose cooperation had helped secure Ashford's conviction, received 5 years in federal prison and permanent revocation of his medical license. His testimony had been valuable, but it hadn't absolved him of responsibility for approving the protocols that had killed patients. Rebecca watched these developments from a distance. She'd moved out of her apartment. The address had been too public, too exposed. She'd rented a small place in a different neighborhood where reporters couldn't find her, and she'd begun the process of trying to return to something resembling a normal life. Except normal life wasn't available anymore. 3 months after Ashford's sentencing, Torres came to her new apartment with an offer that Rebecca had been half expecting since the trial ended. The federal government is establishing a new oversight program for hospital experimental protocols, Torres said. It's designed to prevent what happened at Riverside General from happening anywhere else. They're creating review boards, establishing reporting mechanisms, implementing safeguards that make it much harder for institutions to conduct unauthorized research on patients. That's good, Rebecca said. They want you to help design the program, Torres continued, not as a federal employee, as a consultant, someone with medical training and firsthand experience with how these systems fail, someone who understands what warning signs look like before they become catastrophic. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. I'm a nurse, not a policy expert. You're someone who recognized institutional corruption and refused to participate in it, Torres said. That's exactly the perspective this program needs. Most policy experts have never actually worked in the environments they're regulating. You have. That matters. What would it involve? 6 months of consulting work, meetings with policy teams, review of proposed regulations, input on implementation strategies, and probably some public testimony when the program is formally announced. Torres paused. It would pay well. And it would give you a platform to actually change the systems that tried to destroy you. Rebecca thought about the patients who'd died, the families who'd spent months fighting through legal proceedings just to have their loved ones' deaths acknowledged, the nurses and doctors who'd known something was wrong but hadn't felt empowered to speak up. I'll do it, she said, on one condition. What? I want direct access to the hospital staff who were working at Riverside General during the experimental protocols, not administrators, not people who were involved. The nurses, orderlies, junior residents who saw things but didn't have the authority or protection to report them. I want to understand what prevented them from speaking up, because that's the real systemic failure. The silence that corruption relies on. Torres nodded. Done. The consulting work was harder than Rebecca expected. Not technically, she understood medical protocols and institutional structures well enough to identify failures quickly. But emotionally. Every meeting involved reviewing case files of patients who'd been harmed. Every regulation discussion involved confronting the reality that even good policies couldn't prevent all institutional corruption. Every public hearing involved facing people who blamed her for not acting sooner, for not preventing deaths that had occurred before she even knew the experimental protocols existed. But slowly, the oversight program took shape. Mandatory reporting requirements for any research involving human subjects. Independent review boards with authority to investigate hospitals without administrative approval. Whistleblower protections for medical staff who reported ethical violations. Funding for victims' compensation when protocols violated informed consent standards. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than what had existed before. 6 months after the consulting work began, the federal government announced the new program at a press conference in Washington. Rebecca was invited to attend but declined. She'd had enough of cameras and public attention. She watched the announcement from her apartment via a live stream while eating takeout that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. The program was named the Medical Ethics Accountability Initiative. The announcement emphasized that it had been developed with input from medical professionals, legal experts, and people who'd been directly affected by institutional failures. Rebecca's name was mentioned once, briefly, as a consultant who'd provided valuable perspective. That was enough. Her phone buzzed with a text from Torres. Well done. Rebecca didn't respond. She closed her laptop and sat in the silence of her apartment, feeling something that might have been satisfaction or might have been exhaustion. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. But then, 3 weeks after the federal program announcement, a different kind of call came through. It was from a lawyer representing the patients who'd been harmed by Riverside General's experimental protocols. The civil cases had finally begun moving through the courts now that the bankruptcy protection had been removed. Victims were filing lawsuits, families were seeking compensation, and the hospital, now under federal oversight but still operating, was facing liability claims that could total hundreds of millions of dollars. We'd like you to serve as an expert witness, the lawyer said. Her name was Andrea Moss, and she specialized in medical malpractice cases involving institutional negligence. Your testimony in the criminal trial was compelling, but the civil cases require a different kind of expertise. We need someone who can explain to a jury not just what happened, but what the hospital should have done to prevent it, what protocols should have been in place, what warning signs were ignored. I already testified once, Rebecca said. I know, Andrea replied, and I know how difficult that was. But these victims deserve compensation for what was done to them. And without expert testimony from someone with your background, the hospital's legal team is going to argue that what happened was an unfortunate series of individual mistakes rather than systematic institutional failure. They're going to try to minimize liability by fragmenting responsibility. Rebecca thought about the 17 patients who'd been poisoned, the families who'd lost people, the system that had protected itself for years. How many cases? She asked. 43 confirmed victims, Andrea said. And we're still identifying more as we review historical records. This could end up being one of the largest medical malpractice settlements in federal history. When do you need me? The first case goes to trial in 2 months, Andrea said. I'd like to start preparing your testimony now. Rebecca agreed, which meant spending another 2 months reviewing case files, preparing expert reports, and coordinating with legal teams who were constructing civil cases against the hospital. The work was grimly familiar. The same patterns of institutional negligence, the same documentation failures, the same administrative decisions that prioritize protection over accountability. But the civil trials revealed something the criminal trial hadn't fully exposed: the scope of human cost. In criminal proceedings, the focus was on guilt and punishment. In civil proceedings, the focus was on harm and compensation. And the testimony from victims, people who'd survived the experimental protocols but were now dealing with permanent neurological damage, chronic pain, psychological trauma, made the abstract concept of institutional corruption devastatingly concrete. Rebecca testified in the first civil trial as an expert witness. She explained medical protocols. She detailed what warning signs should have alerted hospital staff to problems. She described what a properly functioning ethics oversight system would have done to prevent the experimental protocols from ever being approved. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and awarded the plaintiff, a woman named Sarah Michaels, who'd been exposed to the neurochemical compound and now dealt with seizures that would likely persist for the rest of her life, $18 million in damages. The hospital's legal team immediately filed appeals, but the verdict sent a clear message. The civil cases weren't going to be settled quietly. They were going to be fought publicly, and the hospital was going to lose. Over the next 6 months, 42 more cases went to trial. Some settled before reaching verdict. Others went to juries that consistently sided with the victims. By the end of the litigation, Riverside General had been ordered to pay over $600 million in total compensation, an amount large enough to fundamentally reshape the hospital's finances and operations. But more importantly, the public nature of the trials meant that every detail of the experimental protocols became part of the public record. News outlets covered the testimony. Investigative journalists wrote comprehensive reports. Documentary filmmakers began projects examining how institutional corruption had been allowed to persist for so long. Rebecca's role in exposing the corruption became part of that narrative. She was the nurse who'd refused to prioritize power over patients, the whistleblower who'd testified despite threats and intimidation, the expert who'd helped victims secure compensation for harm that should never have occurred. She didn't feel like a hero, she felt tired, but she also understood that the work mattered, even when it was exhausting. Then, almost exactly 1 year after she'd been fired from Riverside General, Rebecca received a letter that changed everything one final time. It came from the newly appointed hospital director, a woman named Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who'd been brought in as part of the federal oversight restructuring. The letter was formal but direct. Dear Ms. Walsh, I am writing to offer you a position as Director of Emergency Medical Ethics and Oversight at Riverside General Medical Center. This is a newly created role designed to ensure that the institutional failures that occurred under previous administration never happen again. Your responsibilities would include reviewing all emergency protocols for ethical compliance, training staff on proper reporting procedures for potential violations, serving as a liaison between medical personnel and administration, and providing expert consultation on cases where ethical questions arise. I understand that this hospital caused you significant harm. I understand that returning here might feel impossible, but I also believe that the most powerful way to ensure lasting change is to have people who refuse to compromise their ethics in positions where they can influence institutional culture. If you're interested, I would welcome the opportunity to discuss this position further. Sincerely, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Hospital Director, Riverside General Medical Center. Rebecca read the letter 3 times. Then she called Torres. They offered me a job, Rebecca said, at the hospital that fired me. Are you going to take it? Torres asked. I don't know, Rebecca said. Part of me wants to tell them to go to hell, but another part of me thinks, this is how systems actually change. Not by destroying them completely, but by putting people who refuse to participate in corruption into positions where they can prevent it from happening again. What does your gut say? Rebecca thought about the patients who'd died, the families who'd fought for accountability, the nurses and doctors who'd been silenced, the system that had tried to protect itself and had finally been forced to change. My gut says I'm tired, Rebecca admitted. But my gut also says that tired people are sometimes the only ones who actually understand how broken things are, because we've lived through the consequences. Torres was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I think you'd be good at it. Yeah, Rebecca said. I think I would too. She hung up and looked at the letter again. Director of Emergency Medical Ethics and Oversight, a position that didn't exist a year ago. A position that existed now specifically because she'd refused to let the system silence her. And as she sat in her apartment holding the letter that represented either vindication or just another form of institutional co-optation, Rebecca realized that this was the actual choice. Not whether to fight corruption or accept it, but whether to continue fighting from outside the system or to step back inside and try to change it from within. She thought about writing a response immediately, but instead she put the letter down and walked to her kitchen. She made coffee that was probably too strong. She stood at her window watching Seattle traffic move below, and she let herself sit with the weight of a decision that would define the next phase of her life. Because the truth was, She'd already made the choice the night she refused to prioritize Ashford's son. She'd already decided that she wasn't going to let power dictate medical ethics. And taking the position at Riverside General wasn't acceptance or compromise. It was the continuation of the same fight, just on different territory. She picked up her phone and composed a response to Dr. Rodriguez. 3 sentences, simple and direct. I'm interested in the position, but I need to understand that this role will have actual authority to halt procedures and report violations without administrative interference. If you can guarantee that, we should talk. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came back within 30 minutes. You have my word. Let's schedule a meeting. Rebecca stared at her phone for a long moment. Then she allowed herself something that might have been a smile. Not satisfaction, not victory, just the recognition that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was refuse to let the system break you, and then walk back into that system and force it to be better. But even as she began preparing for the meeting with Dr. Rodriguez, even as she started thinking about what policies she would implement and what changes she would demand, Rebecca received one more message. This one from an unknown number. A text that contained no words, just a photo. It showed a hospital corridor, fluorescent lights, nurses moving through their shifts, and in the background, barely visible, a memorial plaque that hadn't existed before. The plaque listed 17 names, the patients who died during Riverside General's experimental protocols, and beneath the names, a single line of text. They deserved better. We will ensure their deaths were not in vain. Rebecca looked at the photo for a long time. Then she saved it to her phone, got dressed, and walked out of her apartment into the Seattle morning. She had a meeting to prepare for, a position to negotiate, a system to change. And somewhere in a federal prison, Congressman Daniel Ashford was beginning the first day of a 42-year sentence, understanding too late that power without accountability was just borrowed time waiting to expire. The system hadn't collapsed, but it had been wounded. And Rebecca Walsh, the nurse they'd tried to destroy, was about to become the person who decided how it healed. The meeting with Dr. Rodriguez happened on a Tuesday morning in an office that still smelled like fresh paint. The Federal Oversight Committee had gutted the administrative floor, removing every trace of the previous regime. New furniture, new computers, new staff who moved through the hallways with the cautious energy of people rebuilding something from wreckage. Rodriguez was younger than Rebecca expected, maybe mid-40s, with gray streaks and dark hair that she didn't bother hiding. She stood when Rebecca entered, extending a hand that carried the firm grip of someone used to making decisions under pressure. "Thank you for coming," Rodriguez said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Rebecca replied. They sat across from each other at a table that was too new to have accumulated the coffee rings and paperwork scars of actual administrative work. Rodriguez pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be organizational charts, policy documents, and budget projections. "Before we discuss the position," Rodriguez said, "I need you to understand what you'd be walking into. This hospital is operating under federal oversight. We have investigators watching every administrative decision. We have victim compensation cases still pending. We have staff members who worked under the previous administration and are either complicit, traumatized, or both. And we have a public that views this institution as fundamentally corrupt." "I know," Rebecca said. "The Director of Emergency Medical Ethics position isn't symbolic," Rodriguez continued. "It's designed to be the institutional conscience. You'd have authority to halt procedures, launch investigations, report violations directly to federal oversight without administrative approval. But that authority makes you a target. Staff who resent oversight will resent you. Administrators who want to return to business as usual will undermine you. And the media will scrutinize every decision you make looking for evidence that the hospital hasn't actually changed." Ashimit. Rebecca had been preparing for this conversation for days, but hearing it stated plainly made the scope of the challenge undeniable. "Why me?" she asked. "There are medical ethics experts with decades more experience. People who haven't been publicly associated with this hospital's corruption." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Because experts with decades of experience are often people who've learned how to navigate institutional politics without making waves. They're good at their jobs precisely because they understand how to operate within systems. And what this hospital needs isn't someone who knows how to operate within systems. It needs someone who knows when systems are fundamentally broken and has the courage to say so. She leaned forward slightly. "You were fired for refusing to compromise your ethics," Rodriguez said. "That's not a liability in this context. That's exactly the qualification that matters. Because the people working here need to see that refusing to compromise has consequences that aren't just punitive, that it can lead somewhere other than unemployment and federal protection." Rebecca thought about the nurses she'd worked with, the ones who'd watched the experimental protocols and stayed silent because speaking up felt impossible, the ones who'd known something was wrong but hadn't had the authority or protection to act. "If I take this position," Rebecca said, "I'm going to make demands that administration won't like. I'm going to implement protocols that slow down operations. I'm going to prioritize patient safety over efficiency metrics and profit margins, and I'm not going to be diplomatic about it." "Good," Rodriguez said. "That's exactly what this hospital needs." "And when the federal oversight ends? When the investigators leave and the media attention fades? What happens when institutional pressure returns and administration decides that ethics oversight is expensive and inconvenient?" Rodriguez pulled out a document and slid it across the table. It was a contract, but not a standard employment agreement. This was something more comprehensive, a position description that included specific protections, reporting authorities, and termination clauses that required federal approval. "Your position is protected under the hospital's restructuring agreement with federal oversight," Rodriguez said. "It can't be eliminated without approval from the federal committee. You can't be fired without documented cause that's been reviewed by independent investigators. And you have authority to report directly to federal prosecutors if you believe institutional corruption is recurring." Rebecca read through the contract carefully. The protections were real. The authority was substantial. This wasn't a symbolic position designed to make the hospital look reformed. This was an actual structural change with teeth. "When would I start?" Rebecca asked. "Immediately," Rodriguez said. "We're already behind on implementing the new oversight protocols, and we have several pending cases where medical ethics questions need resolution before we can proceed." Rebecca signed the contract without hesitation, not because she was certain it would work, but because uncertainty was the point. The only way to find out if institutional change was possible was to step into the institution and fight for it. Her first day as Director of Emergency Medical Ethics felt surreal in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had an office, small, but with a window overlooking the ambulance bay where she'd been escorted out by security 13 months earlier. She had a staff, 2 junior administrators assigned to help implement the new protocols. She had authority to attend administrative meetings, review medical decisions, and halt procedures if ethical concerns arose. But she also had hostility from staff members who viewed her as a federal plant. She had resistance from administrators who resented oversight, and she had media attention that wouldn't fade no matter how routine her actual work became. On her third day, a senior surgeon named Dr. Marcus Webb confronted her in the hallway outside the surgical wing. He was probably in his late 50s, the kind of doctor who'd spent decades building a reputation and clearly viewed any form of oversight as a personal affront. "You realize you're making it impossible to do our jobs," Webb said without preamble. "Your new protocols require ethics review for procedures that have been standard practice for 20 years. You're creating bureaucratic delays that put patients at risk." "I'm creating accountability," Rebecca corrected. "If a procedure has been standard practice for 20 years but lacks proper informed consent documentation, then it's been wrong for 20 years. And if reviewing it creates delays, then the solution is to document properly from the start." "You're going to destroy this hospital's efficiency metrics," Webb said. "Do you understand what that means for funding, for insurance contracts, for our ability to operate?" "I understand that efficiency metrics don't matter if we're harming patients," Rebecca said. "And if this hospital's financial model depends on cutting corners ethically, then the financial model needs to change." Webb stared at her for a long moment. Then he walked away without another word. That confrontation happened at least once a week for the first 2 months. Different doctors, different complaints, same underlying tension. People who'd operated without oversight were now being forced to justify their decisions, and they hated it. But slowly, something else started happening. Younger staff members, nurses, residents, junior doctors who'd been uncomfortable with the previous administration began coming to Rebecca's office. Not to complain, to report concerns, to ask questions, to verify that the new protocols actually meant something. A nurse named Julia Martinez was the first. She knocked on Rebecca's door 3 weeks after Rebecca had started, holding a patient file that she'd flagged for review. "This might be nothing," Julia said, her voice uncertain. "But there's a patient in the ICU who came in with symptoms that don't match his admission diagnosis. And when I checked his medical history, there are gaps in the documentation that seem deliberate." Rebecca reviewed the file. Julia was right. The gaps were suspicious. The admission diagnosis didn't align with the patient's actual presentation. And the attending physician who'd signed off on the case was one of the doctors who'd worked under the previous administration. "You did the right thing reporting this," Rebecca said. "I'm going to investigate. And Julia, you're not going to face consequences for flagging this. That's what this position exists for." The investigation revealed that the patient had been enrolled in a clinical trial without proper informed consent documentation. Not an experimental protocol like the ones that had destroyed the hospital's reputation, but a legitimate pharmaceutical trial that had failed to follow proper procedures. The attending physician had assumed, incorrectly, that the previous administration's standards still applied. Rebecca halted the trial immediately. She reported the violation to federal oversight. She implemented additional training for all staff involved in clinical research. And she made sure Julia Martinez received recognition for identifying the problem before it escalated. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, other staff members started reporting concerns, not because they were trying to cause problems, but because they finally believed that reporting concerns wouldn't destroy their careers. The culture was starting to shift. 6 months into her position, Rebecca was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee reviewing proposed federal legislation on hospital oversight. The hearing was being held in Washington, and the invitation had come through Torres, who'd apparently suggested Rebecca as someone with practical experience implementing the kind of reforms the legislation aimed to mandate. Rebecca almost declined. She'd had enough of public testimony, enough of cameras and questions and people trying to use her words as ammunition for their political agendas. But Torres called her directly to explain why it mattered. "This legislation could change how hospitals operate nationwide," Torres said, "but it's facing opposition from hospital associations, insurance companies, and political groups who argue that increased oversight will create bureaucratic nightmares. They're claiming that what happened at Riverside General was an isolated incident that doesn't require systemic reform." "It wasn't isolated," Rebecca said. "I know that. You know that. But Congress needs to hear it from someone who's actually implementing these reforms and can speak to whether they're feasible. You're not a theoretical policy expert. You're someone making this work in real conditions. That testimony matters." Rebecca agreed to testify. The hearing room was smaller than the courtroom had been, but somehow more intimidating. Congressional hearings carried a different weight, not legal consequences, but political ones. Whatever she said would be quoted, analyzed, used to support or oppose legislation that would affect millions of patients across the country. The subcommittee chairman, a representative named David Kellerman, called the hearing to order and invited Rebecca to present her opening statement. She'd prepared remarks, but standing at the witness table looking at the assembled representatives, she decided to speak without notes. "My name is Rebecca Walsh," she began. 13 months ago, I was fired from Riverside General Medical Center for refusing to prioritize a congressman's son over patients who were already in critical condition. That decision cost me my job, my career stability, and nearly cost me my safety. But it also exposed a systematic pattern of corruption that had been protected by the exact lack of oversight that this legislation aims to address. She paused, letting that context settle. I'm now the director of emergency medical ethics at that same hospital, implementing the reforms that federal oversight mandated. And I can tell you from direct experience that these reforms are not bureaucratic nightmares. They're necessary corrections to a system that had systematically prioritized institutional protection over patient safety. Representative Kellerman leaned forward. Can you give specific examples of how these reforms have improved patient outcomes? Yes, Rebecca said. Since implementing mandatory ethics review for all experimental protocols, we've identified and halted 3 separate clinical trials that lacked proper informed consent documentation. We've established reporting mechanisms that have allowed junior staff to flag concerns without fear of retaliation. And we've created oversight structures that make it significantly harder for institutional corruption to occur without detection. Another representative, a woman named Sandra Mitchell, who'd been vocal in opposing the legislation, spoke up. But haven't these reforms also created delays in patient care? Increased operational costs? Made it harder for hospitals to function efficiently? They've created accountability, Rebecca said. And yes, accountability takes time. But the alternative is a system where hospitals can conduct unauthorized experiments on patients, where administrators can prioritize wealthy donors over medical ethics, and where staff members who report violations get fired instead of supported. If that's what efficiency looks like, then efficiency isn't worth protecting. The hearing continued for another 3 hours. Representatives asked questions about implementation costs, about potential unintended consequences, about whether the reforms could scale nationally. Rebecca answered each one with the practical experience of someone who'd been doing this work for 6 months and understood both its challenges and its necessity. When the hearing concluded, Representative Kellerman thanked her for her testimony. Ms. Walsh, your perspective has been invaluable. This committee will be considering your recommendations carefully as we finalize the legislation. Rebecca left Washington uncertain whether her testimony would actually influence the final bill. But on the flight back to Seattle, she received a message from Torres that included a news article. The article quoted several representatives who'd shifted their positions on the legislation after hearing Rebecca's testimony. The reforms were gaining momentum. It wasn't victory yet, but it was progress. 1 year after Rebecca had signed the contract to return to Riverside General, Dr. Rodriguez called a hospital-wide meeting to announce the results of the federal oversight review. The auditors had spent 12 months evaluating the hospital's operations, financial practices, and ethical protocols. Their report would determine whether federal oversight could be lifted or whether it needed to continue. Rebecca sat in the auditorium alongside hundreds of other staff members, watching Rodriguez take the stage. The energy in the room was tense. Everyone understood that this report would define the hospital's future. The Federal Oversight Committee has completed their comprehensive review, Rodriguez announced. And I'm pleased to report that Riverside General Medical Center has been found to be in full compliance with all reform requirements. The room erupted into applause. Relief was visible on faces throughout the auditorium, not because people had been actively worried about the findings, but because the uncertainty was finally over. However, Rodriguez continued, and the room quieted immediately. Compliance doesn't mean the work is finished. The reforms we've implemented over the past year are not temporary measures. They're permanent changes to how this institution operates. The Director of Emergency Medical Ethics position will remain. The oversight protocols will remain. The reporting mechanisms will remain. Because what happened here can never happen again. She looked directly at Rebecca. I want to recognize Rebecca Walsh, whose work over the past year has been instrumental in rebuilding trust both within this institution and with the public we serve. Her commitment to medical ethics, even when it created friction and resistance, has set a standard that this hospital will maintain. The applause that followed was different from the initial response, more personal, more directed. People were looking at Rebecca, acknowledging what she'd done. Not everyone was supportive. She could see faces in the crowd that still viewed her with resentment. But enough people understood that she'd been fighting for them, not against them. After the meeting, Rebecca returned to her office to find an envelope on her desk. It had been hand-delivered, no return address, just her name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a letter from Sarah Michaels, the first victim who'd testified in the civil trials, the woman who'd received an $18 million verdict for the neurological damage caused by the experimental protocols. Dear Rebecca, I wanted you to know that I used part of my settlement to establish a foundation for victims of medical experimentation. We're providing legal support, medical care coordination, and advocacy for people who've been harmed by institutional failures like what happened at Riverside General. I'm telling you this because none of it would have been possible without your testimony, without your refusal to compromise, without your willingness to stand up when everyone else was silent. Thank you for being the person who wouldn't break. Sarah Rebecca read the letter twice, then filed it carefully in a drawer where she kept the few pieces of correspondence that mattered. She thought about writing a response, but decided that Sarah didn't need one. The foundation was the response. The work continuing was the response. 18 months after returning to Riverside General, Rebecca received notification that Congressman Daniel Ashford's appeals had been exhausted. Every motion for reduced sentence, every challenge to the conviction, every legal mechanism his attorneys had deployed, all of them had failed. His 42-year sentence was final. The notification came through Torres, who'd remained in contact even as the federal investigation officially closed. They met for coffee at a place near the hospital, sitting by a window that overlooked the street where Rebecca had once been escorted out by security. Ashford's attorneys are claiming he's experiencing health problems in federal prison, Torres said. They're trying to get him transferred to a medical facility, arguing that the prison system isn't equipped to handle his conditions. Is it legitimate? Rebecca asked. Probably, Torres admitted. He's 63. Federal prison is hard on everyone, but it's particularly hard on people who've never experienced consequences before. But the judge has denied the transfer request. Ashford will serve his full sentence in federal custody. Rebecca thought about the congressman who'd demanded immediate treatment, who'd threatened to destroy her career, who'd participated in a criminal enterprise that had killed 17 people. She thought about whether she felt satisfaction at his suffering, and was surprised to realize she didn't feel much of anything. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, just the understanding that accountability sometimes looked like a person sitting in a prison cell, realizing that power had limits. What about the others? Rebecca asked. Dr. Voss, the administrators who were arrested? Most of them are serving their sentences, Torres said. A few accepted plea deals that included cooperation with ongoing investigations into other hospitals. Apparently what happened at Riverside General wasn't as isolated as we initially thought. Federal investigators are now reviewing medical institutions nationwide looking for similar patterns. Good, Rebecca said. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. Torres eventually left to catch a flight back to Washington, and Rebecca walked back toward the hospital. But instead of going directly to her office, she took a detour through the ER. The ambulance bay was busy, paramedics unloading patients, nurses triaging cases, doctors moving between trauma bays with the controlled urgency that defined emergency medicine. It looked exactly like it had looked 2 years earlier when Rebecca had worked those same shifts. But it was different now. The protocols were different. The oversight was different. The culture that said some patients mattered more than others because of who their families were. That was gone, replaced by something that wasn't perfect but was significantly better. Rebecca watched the organized chaos for a few minutes, then headed upstairs to her office. She had meetings scheduled for the afternoon, policy reviews that needed her approval, training sessions for new staff on proper informed consent procedures, the routine work of making sure that institutional change lasted beyond the initial reforms. 2 years after being fired from Riverside General, Rebecca received an invitation that completed a circle she hadn't realized was still open. The invitation came from the federal government, specifically from the congressional subcommittee that had passed the hospital oversight legislation she'd testified to support. They were hosting a ceremony recognizing individuals who'd contributed to major policy reforms, and Rebecca had been named as one of the honorees. She almost declined. She'd received enough recognition, enough public attention. She just wanted to do her work without cameras and ceremonies. But when she mentioned the invitation to Julia Martinez, the nurse who'd been the first to report concerns under the new protocols, Julia's response changed her perspective. "You should go," Julia said. "Not for you, for everyone who works here. Because they need to see that refusing to compromise doesn't just lead to getting fired, it leads to changing systems. That matters." Rebecca attended the ceremony in Washington, wearing the same professional clothing she wore to administrative meetings, refusing to treat this as something extraordinary. The event was held in a federal building, with representatives from Congress, policy experts, and other people who'd contributed to various reform efforts. When her name was called, Rebecca walked to the podium and accepted a commendation that recognized her exceptional courage in exposing institutional corruption and her continued commitment to medical ethics reform. The document was formal and bureaucratic, but the sentiment behind it was genuine. She was invited to speak briefly. She kept her remarks short. 2 years ago, I was fired for doing my job correctly, Rebecca said. I refused to prioritize power over patients, and the institution I worked for decided that made me a liability. But what I learned through that experience is that institutions don't change because they want to. They change because people refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. She looked out at the assembled crowd, politicians, policy experts, advocates, people who worked in various aspects of healthcare reform. The work isn't finished, Rebecca continued. The legislation we passed is important, But legislation alone doesn't change culture. That requires people working every day to implement reforms, to hold institutions accountable, to prioritize patients over profits and power. That's the work that actually matters. And it's hard. And it's frustrating. And it often feels like you're fighting against systems designed to resist change. But it's possible. And it's necessary. The applause that followed was polite but warm. Rebecca stepped away from the podium and returned to her seat, already thinking about the flight back to Seattle and the meeting she had scheduled for the following day. But before she left Washington, Torres met her for dinner at a restaurant near the Federal Building. They sat at a table in the back, away from the crowd, and ordered food that neither of them paid much attention to. "You know you've become a symbol, right?" Torres said. "The nurse who stood up to corruption and won. There are articles being written about you, case studies and medical ethics courses, policy papers citing your testimony." "I didn't win," Rebecca said. "The system just finally acknowledged that what was happening was wrong. That's not victory. That's basic accountability arriving late." "It's more than most people achieve," Torres replied. "Most people who try to expose institutional corruption get destroyed and stay destroyed. You got destroyed and then rebuilt the institution that tried to destroy you. That's significant." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what the hardest part is? It's not the public attention or the policy work or even the hostility from staff who resent oversight. It's knowing that what happened at Riverside General probably happened at other hospitals too. That there are probably other experimental protocols running right now that we don't know about. That institutional corruption is adaptive and finds new ways to protect itself." "So you keep fighting," Torres said. "You implement the reforms you can implement. You train the next generation of medical staff to prioritize ethics. You create systems that make corruption harder to sustain. You don't win once and then stop. You win repeatedly until the culture shifts permanently." "Is that what you think we're doing?" "I think we're trying," Torres said. "And trying is more than most people manage." They finished dinner and said goodbye outside the restaurant. Torres had another case to work on, some other investigation into some other form of institutional failure. Rebecca had a flight to catch back to Seattle, back to her office and her meetings, and the daily work of making sure that Riverside General actually remained reformed, instead of gradually sliding back into old patterns. EMAs. 3 years after being fired, Rebecca stood in the emergency room at Riverside General during a night shift she'd volunteered to cover. One of the junior residents was dealing with a difficult case, a patient in critical condition whose family was demanding immediate intervention despite the medical team's assessment that the patient needed stabilization first. The family member, a man in an expensive suit who clearly expected his demands to be prioritized, was getting increasingly aggressive. The resident was holding firm, but Rebecca could see the pressure building. This was the exact kind of situation that had gotten her fired 3 years earlier. She walked over quietly. "Is there a problem?" Rebecca asked. "This resident is refusing to treat my father immediately," the man said. "I'm a major donor to this hospital, and You expect the medical team to follow proper emergency protocols?" Rebecca interrupted calmly, "which is exactly what they're doing. Your father's being stabilized before intervention because that's the standard of care that keeps patients alive, and your status as a donor is irrelevant to medical decision-making." The man stared at her. "Do you know who I am?" "No," Rebecca said. "And it doesn't matter. The protocols here prioritize patient safety over donor relationships. If you have concerns about the quality of care your father is receiving, you can file a formal complaint with the Medical Ethics Office. That's me. But you can't demand that medical procedures be altered to accommodate your preferences." The resident was watching this exchange with something close to awe. This was the new culture in practice. Someone in authority backing up medical staff when they made ethically correct decisions, regardless of external pressure. The man eventually backed down, and the medical team continued treating his father according to proper protocols. The patient survived and later thanked the resident for making the right call despite family pressure. After the case concluded, the resident approached Rebecca. "That was the kind of situation that used to get people fired here," the resident said quietly. "Before you came back, before the reforms, staff would cave to pressure because they knew administration wouldn't support them." "I know," Rebecca said. "I was fired for making exactly that call." And now you're in charge of making sure other people don't get fired for doing the right thing. That's the job, Rebecca said. She walked back to her office as the night shift continued around her. 3 years of work. 3 years of reforms and resistance and gradual cultural change. 3 years of proving that institutions could be rebuilt if enough people refused to accept corruption as normal. 4 years after being fired, Rebecca stood at the memorial plaque honoring the 17 patients who died during Riverside General's experimental protocols. The plaque had been installed in the main hospital atrium, visible to everyone entering the building. It had become a reminder, not just of what had happened, but of the institutional commitment to prevent it from happening again. She came here sometimes when the work felt overwhelming, when administrators pushed back against oversight, when staff complained about protocols being too restrictive, when the daily grind of institutional reform felt like pushing against a tide that never stopped. "I thought I might find you here." Rebecca turned. Dr. Rodriguez was standing a few feet away, holding 2 cups of coffee. She offered one to Rebecca. "The board just approved the budget for next year," Rodriguez said. "Your department is being expanded. 2 additional staff members, increased training budget, and authority to conduct proactive audits instead of just responding to reported concerns." "That's progress," Rebecca said. "It is," Rodriguez agreed. "But I wanted to tell you something else. The federal government just released their nationwide audit of hospital experimental protocols. They found evidence of unauthorized research at 43 different institutions. Not all of them as severe as what happened here, but enough to trigger investigations at multiple hospitals." Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. 43 institutions. How many victims? "Still being determined," Rodriguez said. But the audit cited Riverside General's reforms as the model for how other hospitals should restructure their oversight. Your work here is being used as the template for systemic change. Rebecca thought about that. 43 institutions, decades of unauthorized research, hundreds or thousands of victims. And the reforms that had started here, reforms that had felt impossibly difficult to implement, were now being replicated nationwide. "Does it feel worth it?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "The 4 years of fighting, the hostility, the constant pressure to prove that these reforms matter." Rebecca looked at the memorial plaque. 17 names, 17 people who deserved better. 17 deaths that had exposed a system that was fundamentally broken. "Yes," Rebecca said. "It's worth it." Kent. 5 years after being fired from Riverside General, Rebecca Walsh stood in front of a graduating class of medical students at the university where she'd completed her nursing training. She'd been invited to give a commencement address, which she'd initially declined before being persuaded by several students who'd specifically requested her as their speaker. She looked out at the assembled graduates, young people about to enter a medical field that was still struggling with the same systemic problems that had defined her career. She'd prepared remarks, but standing at the podium, she decided to speak from experience instead of notes. 5 years ago, Rebecca began, I was fired from a job for refusing to compromise my medical ethics. I prioritized patients over power, and the institution I worked for decided that made me a liability. For a long time, I thought that was the end of my career. That standing up for what was right had destroyed any chance I had of actually making a difference in medicine. She paused, looking at the faces of students who were trying to figure out what kind of careers they were about to build. I was wrong, Rebecca continued. Not about the consequences. I was fired, and it was devastating, and it nearly destroyed me. But I was wrong about it being the end. Because what I learned is that systems don't change when everyone inside them accepts that corruption is normal. Systems change when enough people refuse to participate in corruption, even when refusing costs them everything. She thought about the last 5 years. The trial. The reforms. The gradual cultural shift that had transformed Riverside General from an institution that protected power to one that actually prioritized patients. You're about to enter a field where you will face pressure to compromise, Rebecca said. Pressure to prioritize profits over patients. Pressure to accept that some people matter more than others because of who they are or how much money they have. Pressure to participate in systems that are fundamentally broken because that's how things have always been done. The auditorium was completely silent. And when you face that pressure, Rebecca continued, you will have to decide who you want to be. Whether you're going to be someone who accepts corruption as normal or someone who refuses to participate in it even when refusing is terrifying. That decision will define your career. It will define the kind of medical professional you become. And it will define whether the next generation of patients receives better care than the previous one. She looked directly at the graduates. 5 years ago, I made that decision. And it cost me my job, my safety, and my sense that doing the right thing actually mattered. But it also exposed institutional corruption that had been harming patients for years. It led to reforms that are now being implemented at hospitals nationwide. And it taught me that the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let systems break you and then work to break the systems that tried. The applause that followed was immediate and sustained. Rebecca stepped away from the podium, her part in the ceremony complete. But as she left the stage, several students approached her with questions, with thanks, with expressions of commitment to carrying forward the kind of ethics she'd fought to protect. And Rebecca understood something she hadn't fully grasped 5 years earlier. Individual acts of refusing to compromise didn't just affect individual situations. They created ripples. They influenced other people's decisions. They gradually shifted cultures in ways that weren't immediately visible, but were fundamentally permanent. Inc. Rebecca returned to Riverside General that evening. Her office was quiet, the administrative wing mostly empty except for night staff. She sat at her desk and looked out the window at the ambulance bay, the place where she'd been escorted out by security 5 years earlier, humiliated and convinced her career was over. She thought about everything that had happened since: the trial that had destroyed Ashford, the reforms that had rebuilt the hospital, the legislation that had created nationwide accountability, the victims who'd finally received compensation, the culture that had slowly shifted from protecting power to protecting patients. None of it had been easy. None of it had been clean or simple or free of setbacks. But it had been possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Julia Martinez. New admit in trauma 2. Possible ethics concern. Can you review? Rebecca stood, grabbed her tablet, and headed toward the ER. Because the work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Systems didn't change once and then stay changed forever. They required constant vigilance, constant pressure, constant refusal to accept that corruption was normal. But as she walked through the hospital where she'd been fired and then fought her way back to rebuild, Rebecca understood something fundamental about power and accountability and what it meant to stand up when everyone else was silent. The system hadn't wanted to change. It had fought against every reform, resisted every accountability measure, deployed every legal and institutional mechanism to protect itself. But it had changed anyway. Because enough people had refused to participate in corruption, because enough victims had demanded justice, because enough medical professionals had prioritized patients over institutional loyalty, and because one nurse had refused to compromise her ethics, even when refusing cost her everything. Rebecca reached the ER and reviewed the case Julia had flagged. It was a judgment call, a patient whose treatment plan raised minor questions about informed consent documentation, the kind of thing that would have been ignored 5 years earlier, the kind of thing that now triggered immediate review because the culture had shifted. She approved the hold on treatment pending proper documentation. The attending physician wasn't happy about it, but he complied, because that was what compliance meant now. Not blind obedience, but ethical accountability. As Rebecca finished her review and walked back toward her office, she passed the memorial plaque one final time. 17 names, 17 people who would never benefit from the reforms their deaths had made possible, but hundreds or thousands of future patients who would. The work continued, the fight continued. The gradual, difficult, exhausting process of making sure that power never again meant the ability to harm people without consequence, that continued. And Rebecca Walsh, the nurse they'd tried to break, was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to let systems protect themselves at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve. That was victory, not perfect, not clean, but real. And in the end, that was the only kind of victory that actually mattered.